You better believe I've spent all morning benching Black Myth Wukong, and how could I do that? The game doesn't come out for a week. I didn't get early access. You could do this too. On Steam, there just dropped a Black Myth Wukong benchmark tool, which is free, and you get a whole bunch, graphic settings and everything. I can't tell you how well this lines up to the full actual gameplay and all of that, but it's a pretty comprehensive benchmark suite, so I think it should give you a pretty good idea how the game will perform. Speaking of which, this is an Unreal Engine game, and those sometimes have shader compilation issues. I'm happy to report that we did get a shader pre-compilation step in the benchmark. However, I will say that when I compare my first run of this up against my second run, which I have recorded here, I will say that my second run has a smoother overall frame time graph in a few cases. In other words, I'm not convinced that the shader pre-compilation step found every single result. Now, one way we could look at this rather than looking at the entire benchmark here is there's a nice report card screen at the end of this benchmark, which is cool. And notice the minimum frames per second here as 47. And let me go to run 1 and jump to the end. And notice the minimum FPS was 36. And if we look here, you can see these spikes on the frame time graph, a few bigger ones here. And when we compare it to run 2, notice that those spikes are kind of smoothed out a bit. So in other words, this is just a built-in benchmark demo tool. It's not the full released game. But again, despite the shader pre-compilation step, there is evidence that not all of the shaders were pre-compiled, and we did have additional stutters the first time through compared to the second time through, which is not great. I also noticed something that didn't show up as much in my recording of it as I noticed when I was just actually viewing it on my screen, but with frame generation enabled on my 4090, I felt like certain things almost seemed to be flickering slightly, almost like there was a little bit of a strobing of dark and light on some of the tree branches and things, but I'm playing the footage behind me here, and I don't think it's as noticeable in the recorded footage. So I don't know if I'm just crazy when I was running it, but it did seem repeatable in person. But then when I look at the recorded footage, I'm not seeing it. Now, speaking of the recorded footage, the way I do my benchmarks is I run 2 PCs. So one PC is using a capture card and doing the recording, so there is absolutely no performance overhead on the PC playing the game. So we get the exact performance numbers because the PC playing the game just thinks it's plugged into a monitor. Now that's good, however, capture cards and YouTube videos don't really properly support variable refresh rate, which means that if we are looking for stutters and things like that, you should be watching the frame time graph and the 1% lows, rather than watching what the footage actually looks like. Because when you're watching a 60 frame per second YouTube video, you're not watching the same thing you would be seeing on a variable refresh rate display in person, which can lead to, the way I've captured it can lead to, screen tearing and things looking juddery when they're out of sync with that exact 60 FPS lock. The way to get perfect footage would be to VSync lock to 60 FPS. However, then we would be disrupting our performance numbers. Speaking of performance numbers, this video is going to focus on testing pretty much every setting in this game, but that meant I had to narrow it down to one graphics card to test it on to look at all that scaling in order to get this video out here. So this is going to be the RTX 4090. However, I plan on releasing follow-up videos that test out a huge number of graphic settings in other GPUs, and especially GPUs that might be more like what you might actually have. Now I'm going to stop talking quite so much, shrink down out of the way. Well, maybe not stop talking, but I'll stop being so distracting. Let's take a look at what we're seeing here. So this is trying to play the game on an RTX 4090 at 4K native. Now this game is one of NVIDIA's big path tracing showcase games, or full RT. However, it's pretty demanding, and that's what we're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen, with no upscaling, no frame generation, none of that. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we're seeing 4K native at cinematic settings, which are the highest non-ray traced settings. And it's actually interesting. I wouldn't call the full RT settings a complete win overall. Some of the, I think the biggest thing I notice on the full RT settings is the shadowing seems a lot more stable. The shadowing seems a lot more kind of flickery on the cinematic side of the screen. However, there's definitely differences in the water reflections and caustics and things like that. However, again, frame rate wise, we're getting about double the frame rate using the non-ray traced settings. Now, there are reduced ray trace settings that I'll be testing out here as well as reduced non-ray trace settings. But I want you to watch carefully as we come up these stairs. Look at the grass on the ray traced side of the screen right as we come up these stairs. Look at the grass. Do you see how it flickers and shimmers weirdly before stabilizing? So it seems like even at the very highest full RT settings, there can be some issues with the ray traced results, especially, like I said, when you kind of see that grass coming up that stairs, but other objects that kind of get disoccluded and come into view from the previous frame. I again sometimes see that sparkling and flickering, which I wonder if it has something to do with like the denoising or the amount of rays they're sending out into the scene, or how long it takes to kind of build up good settings there. So again, there's definitely some things that look a lot better in the full RT mode, but there's definitely some things that don't. So it's not a clear win, and it is a big performance hit. However, I did notice something else interesting, which is that as you use upscaling, which at 4K, even on a 4090 at these kinds of settings in this type of game, you would probably want to do, the performance lead for not ray tracing diminishes. Remember when we were using native 4K resolution, the non-ray traced max settings were about double the performance of the ray traced max settings. Here, using DLSS quality, we're seeing a 62% performance lead for the non-ray trace settings. So that's diminished a bit. And the non-ray trace settings here are hitting 68 frames per second, whereas the ray trace settings are hitting 42. So clearly, even on an RTX 4090 using DLSS quality, the full RT settings are going to be a bit much. I don't think most people would be wanting to play on a 4090 at 42 frames per second average. Now, again, there's definitely differences in the water reflections and things like that. Again, differences in the shadows. You can be looking at the side-by-sides here, but both of them look quite good at DLSS quality settings, which is nice. And again, getting that 60 FPS and above on the right-hand side of the screen certainly seems a bit more appealing. Now, one note when I say DLSS quality here, in most games, you just have those setting choices like quality, performance, balanced, like that. However, in this game, there's actually something I really like, which is the graphics settings menu gives you a resolution slider, and it allows you to manually adjust it with a lot more granular detail as a percentage of each axis's render resolution. So what I've actually done here is I've selected 67% because it's 67% per axis, which is the normal choice for DLSS quality. However, this game allows more granular detail. I also noticed that the this benchmark report card at the end usually reports that it kind of rounded my percentage choice slightly differently than what I actually set it to. So I set it to 67%, but sometimes it would set itself to 66 or 65, which I found a little bit interesting, but I do love having the granular detailed control. Anyway, another thing I noticed is that if we go to even more aggressive DLSS settings here, so this is DLSS Performance, which I've manually selected at 50% per axis scaling, so in other words, an internal rendering resolution of 1080p. Notice that not only does the performance go up again here, so the full RT settings at very high, the maxed out ray tracing settings are now averaging over 60 frames per second at 63. However, the non-ray trace settings are only taking a 30% lead now at 82. Now, so in other words, we're seeing a pretty massive difference in how costly it is to enable the full RT settings, depending on what your rendering resolution is internally before DLSS. Or in other words, it looks like the full RT effects are a lot more resolution dependent when we're talking about performance than the non-ray traced settings in this game. So as we lower the internal rendering resolution, the frame rates are boosting at a higher multiple for the full RT settings than they are for the non-ray trace settings on the cinematic mode. And by the way, we will definitely look at the other ray traced settings and the other non-ray trace settings. I just thought this was pretty interesting. Also, both are getting pretty good performance numbers here. And so I really think that if you're planning on using DLSS performance at 4K on a 4090, which, okay, it's a 4090, not everybody's gonna have that, both of these are actually pretty playable here. So again, you'd wanna look at those image quality differences between the RT and non-RT. I really do think the shadows are looking significantly better with ray tracing enabled, and some of the reflections are. However, like I said, especially as we go up these stairs and turn corners on them and things like that, and look at like grass being disoccluded, there are places on the ray tracing side where I feel like it comes out a bit kind of sparkly and unsteady until it has time to kind of cope with those things coming into the screen. So again, I don't feel like the full RT is a hands out win at everything. Anyway, those are the overall performance results there, but this game does also feature frame generation. Here I chose to look at frame generation off of the performance mode upscaling, but of course you could have used it off the quality upscaling or even off of no upscaling. So do, take that for what it is. Now, using frame generation, remember, does not increase the responsiveness of the game, unlike normal frame rate boosts do. What it does is increases the motion fluidity of the game. So you need to have a high enough base frame rate before enabling it for the game to feel responsive, and then it helps smooth out the motion fluidity, but can cause some image quality artifacting. Again, when I was looking at this in person on my screen, I felt like there was a little bit of a dark light strobing effect almost. It was a little bit strange when I had frame generation enabled, and I did find it repeatable. However, I'm not seeing that here in the recorded footage again. So not sure if I was just like completely crazy when I spotted that, or if something about doing the recording has, gotten rid of, it's kind of hiding that artifact that I was seeing. But anyway, also this gets you once again another look at the full ray tracing versus the non-ray traced max results, so you can once again take a look at which one you prefer here. Frame rate wise, we're hitting 99 versus 122, which is only giving a 23% advantage to the non-ray traced results when we're using all the DLSS upscaling and frame gen features. But look at the grass right now. Look at the grass right now on the left-hand side of the screen, and you can rewind the YouTube video and watch it again. It kind of flickers weirdly when it comes up those stairs. And again, that's not happening all the time, but it is certainly a thing that I was noticing during the benchmark runs. I'm not sure how noticeable that would be during normal actual gameplay or anything like that. Because again, this built-in benchmark is not a playable demo. It's just, it takes you on this path through the forest by the river. So you can test out performance and look at the visuals, but you can't actually see what it's like to play the game. Anyway, so again, interesting that the performance difference here is now only 23% once you've activated all of those features. So kind of interesting. What I'd like to do next, though, is zero in on the ray tracing settings. I'll move my body cam here out of the way. So what we're looking at now is the different ray tracing settings. The game offers several of them. So you have very high RT, which we're seeing on the left. We have RT medium, which we're seeing in the middle, and you have RT low, which we're seeing on the right-hand side. And we can also see the performance scaling between them. There's a 31% performance jump when going from very high to medium, but only a small additional 2 frames per second when going from medium to low. So, and then when you look at this visually, especially in the reflections, you can see that in the low settings, there's often a lot of things missing from the reflections when we're at the low settings. And that's showing up as if it's almost reflecting the sky or something like that, when clearly on the very high and medium settings, that's not what this is supposed to look like. So I would say that the medium settings certainly seem to be a better choice than the low settings, at least on the 4090 here, because again, the performance differential is very small, but the visuals look very, very different when comparing the low with the medium full RT settings. So anyway, Any of these settings are pretty demanding, considering we're at DLSS quality on an RTX 4090. Granted, we are on a 4K screen here, but it is an RTX 4090, and none of these are actually averaging 60 frames per second, although the medium and low settings do get close. Again, watch the grass as we come up the staircase. And the issues I notice with that flickering, I think, are accentuated on the lower settings. Probably a fewer number of, rays per pixel or whatever, that's causing those issues, resolving that detail. So something to, think about when we're choosing those ray tracing settings. But again, it certainly seems like the very high settings and the medium settings look noticeably better than the low settings. And the low settings aren't that much more performant than the medium settings, so it certainly seems like your choice would probably be to either use the very high settings or the medium settings if you were going to be using these ray tracing settings. Also, you could use more aggressive upscaling. So what we're going to look at next is going to be throwing out the low settings because I didn't think they were an optimal choice, but now we're looking at DLSS performance mode. So we're at a 1080p internal rendering resolution. You notice that our average frame rates have gone up compared to the quality settings we were testing last time. But now you get a closer look at the probably more optimal ray tracing choices, which are the very high settings and the medium settings. And I would say when you look at the differences in the water reflections, you can actually notice a lot more resolution detail in the very high settings than you see at the medium settings. So again, if you're just kind of zeroing in on those water reflections, I do think the very high settings do look noticeably better. If you look at the rocks reflecting into the bank, and things like that on the right-hand side of the screen. Again, it looks a lot more kind of pixelated and not put together on the right-hand side. The left-hand side, I think, looking a lot more stable. So anyway, I don't think it's a drastic difference. So if you are choosing to use ray tracing and you just need the extra performance, here we're seeing that at DLSS performance mode, it's 22% better performance to use the medium full ray tracing settings than the very high full ray tracing settings. It's in terms of actual frame rate numbers, it's 63 FPS versus 77. So again, it is better. But did you see the grass flicker there, especially on the right-hand side of the screen as it became visible from under the branches? Or once again, as we go up these stairs, I know I keep saying it every time we look at the ray tracing settings, but look at the grass, and especially on the right-hand side of the screen compared to the left-hand side of the screen, it's worse. So there are these disocclusion issues where the grass seems to kind of break down in the ray tracing mode, and it is distracting, at least in this benchmark run. Again, I'm very curious how much in actual gameplay we would see that type of situation occur. Again, I'm not sure what kind of camera angles we'll be at when we're using when we're actually in gameplay versus the kinds of camera angles that we're getting here. And so anyway, there's a lot of questions there, but again, RT medium settings when you're using DLSS performance are 22% faster, which is certainly noticeable, but not like completely worlds apart, and there were additional issues to the visual quality and all of that. But what if you're not going to be ray tracing? Let me move myself out of the way again. So here's a look at all of the graphics presets that don't involve ray tracing. Going from left to right, we have cinematic, very high, high, medium. Oh no, I messed up here, guys. Okay, this one should not say medium. On the right-hand side of the screen here, I'm gonna cover my. No, this says low. Okay, can you? I'm low apparently. So okay. Typo. I'm not going to re-record this whole video and re-render this whole thing just for that. Okay, that's low settings. Anyway, we can see that going from cinematic settings is the baseline. Going to very high only gains you 11% performance. This is all at 4K native resolution. Going to high settings versus the cinematic max non-ray trace settings gains you 43% performance. Going from cinematic to medium gains you 81% performance. And going from cinematic to low, which again is what's really on the right-hand side of the screen here, gains you 200 and, it gains you 121% more performance, meaning it's 2.21 times the frame rate. So the absolute frame rates here are 47, 52, 67, 85, and 104. Now you can see some of the visual differences here, although some of them are just hidden by being cut off of the screen. So we're going to look at some of these next to each other in more detail where you can see a wider shot of the screen. And I think some of the differences become more apparent. I can tell you that the low settings certainly look quite bad compared to the other settings. But every setting does have a noticeable tick down in quality. We can see that the first large performance jump is going from cinematic to high. So that one seems potentially worth it. And then going from high to medium is going from 67 FPS to 85. So that's still quite a big jump. Now, going all the way down to low is another large performance jump, but again, while a lot of it's hidden off screen because we're trying to fit 5 things onto the screen at the same time here, I can tell you that when you zoom out and see the whole thing, the low settings do actually look quite noticeably worse than everything else. So I would say that, if you have a graphics card where that's what you need to do, then that's what you need to do. But I'm certainly most interested in cinematic, high, and medium. And especially for a high-end graphics card, I'm interested in going down from cinematic to high. So that's what we're going to look at here. So right now we're looking at DLSS quality rather than native, and I'm zooming out if you want to look at it that way, but I'm highlighting the cinematic settings and the high settings. So on a 4090 with DLSS quality, the cinematic, in other words, max non-ray trace settings, get 68 frames per second, which is fine. It's completely playable. You could use those settings. The high settings hit 100 though. And I want to point something out here, which is look at the shadows on the right-hand side of the screen versus the left-hand side of the screen. Because technically the high settings should look worse, right? I mean, high should be, a lower setting and it is more performant. But if you look at the shadows on the cinematic settings on the left-hand side of the screen, I find that maybe because they're trying to draw in more detail and motion, to me they look more noticeably flickery. Like look at the rock right now on both of those. The shadow on that rock is a bit flickery on the cinematic settings and seems more stable to me on the high settings. And this is consistent throughout this test, where to me, I actually find maybe the less detailed shadows at high that are less flickery movement to them to be visually preferable because I find it less distracting to the more flickery but potentially more detail within it of the cinematic settings. So I just found that to be kind of an interesting quirk, at least in my personal preference on the shadow settings here. You certainly get more shadows and more detail with the cinematic ones, but again, they kind of move and that makes them kind of flickery looking to me. Anyway, so I would say that my strong preference here would actually be to play at high settings rather than cinematic settings, although tweaking individual settings rather than just the full graphics preset is probably going to be the best way to go. But here we're getting 47% performance by going down to high settings. And I think you guys would agree that while certain things were obviously downgraded, high settings still looked quite good, and you're now getting 100 frames per second. So I think it would be definitely a worthwhile compromise to make on the graphics there. And like I said, for me, I thought the high settings might even be preferable. But what about 1440p resolution? So 1440p on an RTX 4090 still makes a lot of sense. I think some people buy them for 1440p GPUs, some people buy 4090s for 4K GPUs. Either way, let's go ahead and look at the performance here. So if we're doing the non-ray trace settings, once again, I think the main choices would be cinematic or high. Cinematic being, okay, here's our max settings, but again, look at the flickery shadows right back here that I'm pointing at here, and look at this over here. I get that that's probably trying to draw in more like movement in the tree branches and detail and things like that. But again, to me, it looked a little bit low res and flickery, at least how my eyes perceived it. So like I said, there's certainly some downgrades by going to high instead of cinematic in certain things. But those shadows to me kind of stick out as I almost prefer them on a high. So considering we're also getting a big performance jump here, in this case, we're going from 74 frames per second to 105. That's a 42% performance bump. I think the high settings still look very, very good. and would probably be my preference here. But again, if you're on an RTX 4090 and you're playing at 1440p, you probably kind of want to max games out. So of course you could just click cinematic and feel good about yourself because you click the bigger setting. But 105 frames per second, I know for me, if I'm in single player games, once I'm in that 90 to 100 FPS kind of ballpark, that's where I feel really good about things. Whereas 74 still feels totally fine. I do still notice differences going up to around 100 or so in single player titles. So again, I think the high settings could be an interesting choice here. Again, you can look at the graphical differences, but for me, I think it's worth the 42% performance bump here. Now, another thing I'll mention here is that we're using DLAA for native, and some people might be like, why not use TAA? DLAA can be more demanding, higher performance cost. This benchmark didn't have TAA. It does have TSR, but when I tested TSR versus DLAA, TSR was actually more demanding. So DLAA was actually more performant on the 4090 than TSR was. But anyway, the other thing we could choose if we were playing at 1440p was, again, the choice between using the full ray tracing effects versus the non-ray traced effects. So here we're looking at full native resolution, 1440p, full RT, very high settings on the left versus the maxed non-ray trace settings on the right. And we're seeing 45 FPS on the left versus 74 FPS if we turn off the ray tracing. That gives us a 64% performance boost to not use the ray tracing. And again, I think for me here, that performance hit, I'm on an RTX 4090 at 1440p. I don't necessarily want to be using upscaling if I don't have to, unless I'm getting some kind of massive visual upgrade from those full RT effects. And I really think both sides of the screen look pretty good here. So, there's definitely things that can be preferable on either one. But yeah, it's a 64% performance difference. So that's certainly quite a bit. You've gotta wow me to take that 64% performance hit. And I don't know, again, you guys totally can make your own judgment call in the comment section down below, or if you're running it on your own system. I am curious what you guys think about all of it. But again, as we go up these stairs, I want you to look at the grass on the ray tracing side of the screen on the left compared to the right. So right as we get up these stairs, it just flickers weirdly, and I find that very distracting. Now, I don't know, maybe it's just me that's finding that distracting, and again, it doesn't seem to be a constant thing happening all the time. But I would like if I'm giving up 64% performance, for it just to be obviously night and day better in every single way. And it's better in some ways, but not in every way. And it's 64% performance. So that's where I'm at with things. You guys can definitely be wherever you want to be with that. But of course, you can adjust settings on the full RT mode. I'm using the cinematic settings as the baseline to then enable the full RT mode. Just as a heads up, you could have tweaked other non-ray tracing settings in addition to that. You can also use DLSS to try to boost performance. So if you are at 1440p, DLSS quality can definitely still look quite good. And so if we use DLSS quality, the full RT very high settings jump up to 73 frames per second. And the cinematic non-ray trace settings with DLSS quality at 1440p are jumping up to 92 frames per second. So if you are going to be upscaling, do notice that then the performance difference here is a lot smaller. It's only a 26% performance difference between the full RT and the no RT, which is, like I said, pretty interesting. Again, we saw the same thing happening at the 4K resolution when we looked at the ray tracing versus non-tracing performance, and then looked at it once we applied upscaling. So it again seems to be the case at 1440p that applying upscaling reduces the performance difference between ray tracing and non-ray tracing. Again, my assumption being that the ray tracing effects, just performance-wise, are more bound by rendering resolution, and so lowering that rendering resolution gives you that larger performance bump. So with that in mind, if you are going to be using at least DLSS quality at 1440p, then the performance hit is a lot less less worrisome, right? If it's a 26% difference. Now, it's still noticeable. It's 73 FPS versus 92. And once again, as we climb these stairs, look at the grass on the left-hand side of the screen. It does that weird little flicker. And again, it's not just there. I point that one out every time because that's the most noticeable place in this benchmark run, but it's not the only place it happens. When you see like trees uncover some grass behind it, you can see that same kind of little flicker effect happens. So might just depend on which types of things you find more distracting when you're playing the game yourself. So I don't know, there's a lot of ways you could go with this, but again, I do just find it interesting that the performance difference between ray tracing on and off is so dependent on whether or not we're using upscaling and at what upscaling settings we're going with and all of that. It's pretty interesting. So anyway, there's the benchmark results on that. Now, if you do want to use ray tracing, let me slide myself out of the way here a little bit. So if you are going to be using ray tracing, again, you have the choice between the very high settings, the medium settings, and the low settings. Now, if you're running at native resolution at 1440p on the RTX 4090, then we once again, similar to what we saw at 4K resolution, see that the medium settings get you a decent performance jump, in this case 29%, whereas going all the way down to the low settings, in this case only get you 2 more frames per second, averaging from 58 to 60, so not much. And again, especially when you look at the water reflections, we're seeing very large differences between the water reflections in the very high and medium versus at the low. So low looks a lot different, doesn't gain you much more performance. So once again, I think if you are going to be using ray tracing settings and choosing between them, I think it's really between the very high and the medium as the ones that make the most sense here. Now, on an RTX 4090, the medium settings are hitting 58 FPS with native resolution here. So if you are wanting to play with ray tracing on, but not upscale at 1440p on an RTX 4090, and you want to play at around 60 frames per second, it's looking like the RT medium settings are going to be the way to go, since the very high settings are still hanging out down around 45 frames per second. But again, you do have the choice to use upscaling, use frame generation, adjust some of the other baseline settings that aren't ray tracing related. Again, I'm running all of these ray tracing settings off of the cinematic settings as a baseline and then enabling the full RT effects. So I have not had the time yet, because there's already enough to test out, what happens if you change the underlying non-RT effects performance-wise when running RT. So there's definitely room to play around with and see if you could find some more optimized settings or something like that. So anyway, that's where we are at here. You do hit a 60 FPS average on the 1440p native full RT if you go with low. But again, it's such a small performance jump over medium, and there's a very large visual difference in those reflections especially, which means I think your main choices for ray tracing at 1440p should be between very high settings and medium settings. And that's what we're looking at here head to head, but I've also enabled DLSS quality now. So if you enable DLSS quality, the performance difference again decreases. So now we're actually noticing only a 16% performance difference or performance advantage for going down to medium. But if you look at the water reflections again, I think they're noticeably higher resolution when using the very high settings for ray tracing. So given that it's only a 16% performance difference in this case, I think that if you are going to be using upscaling, like DLSS quality at 1440p, and you're choosing to use ray traced settings, I actually feel like the very high settings might be the more optimal choice. As, like I said, it's only a 16% performance gain to drop down to medium, but I do find those reflections, again, just keep watching the reflections back and forth, and I think it is pretty noticeably lower resolution on the RT medium settings compared to the RT very high settings. The RT very high settings, when using DLSS quality, does hit 73 frames per second. And again, we haven't even used frame generation yet if you wanted to use that to kind of smooth out the motion fluidity from there. And again, if this is a game that this type of game probably playing on a controller, things like that. And again, the RT Medium has a lot more of that grass flicker, and it lasts longer when we went up those stairs right there. So I think, again, if you're on a 4090 playing at 1440p and you want to use DLSS quality and you want to use ray tracing settings, I think the very high settings are the better choice than the medium settings, since it's a high enough frame rate. And I do think there are those noticeable visual quality advantages to the very high settings over the medium settings. So anyway, I think that's enough ray tracing testing at 1440p on these GPUs. So what else is there to take a look at? Well, for one thing, we can look at the nice benchmark results at the end here, so you can get the full-on info on all of that. By the way, the VRAM usage is pretty low. Unreal Engine 5 is pretty efficient on VRAM usage, but the last thing I thought I'd test out is for any of you out there with an RTX 4090, but you're still playing on a 1080p screen. Maybe that's because you're mostly a an esports player, so you want max frame rates, so you got that 4090 and the 1080p display, but you still play some single player games from time to time. You're interested in Black Myth Wukong. What have I got for you? Well, I did test out just these two settings at 1080p, because realistically, I don't think most people are at 1080p on these, on a 4090 here, but what we're seeing is the very high RT settings on the left-hand side of the screen do average over 60 frames per second at 1080p without upscaling. So at least there's that. It's 66 frames per second here. Whereas if you choose to use the max settings that don't involve ray tracing, we can hit 89 frames per second. Which is a 35% performance advantage to not using ray tracing if you're playing at 1080p on an RTX 4090, for both of you out there. I mean, I know you guys are out there, but anyway. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, anyway, I have a lot of thoughts overall about this game and its what I'm making of its optimization so far. So perhaps I'll pop out with kind of some final thoughts here at the end. So, I mean, when you look at a result like this, an RTX 4090 at 1080p resolution in max settings in this game are barely over 60 frames per second. I think a lot of people would take that as a chance to call the game extremely unoptimized. However, I really don't think whether or not a game is optimized depends on how well do its maximum settings run. I have no problem with the maximum settings in a game being incredibly demanding, as long as there's something visually to show for it. I don't even mind graphic settings that are really targeting future generations of hardware. What matters to me is if these settings are scalable, right? So you can run on incredibly high-end future hardware and still give it a challenge and have it look really great. And can you scale it all the way back to much lower hardware? So that's where it becomes a little more interesting. Now, somewhere in here was my non-ray traced settings where we scaled here. So something like this, I think, speaks well for the game's scalability, because here we're looking at, without even using upscaling and without even involving ray tracing into this result, but just in the non-ray trace settings. And again, I had this. This should say low. Okay, that should say low settings. Anyway, but we're seeing a lot of scalability here. Going from cinematic to low settings, we're going from 47 to 104. So you're more than doubling the frame rate by adjusting normal graphics settings, which is good. And then you can use upscaling on top of that to get even more scalability to boost performance further. And like I said, you also have those heavy ray tracing effects and things like that if you want to push things even beyond the non-ray trace settings in terms of how demanding it is. Now, the last thing I really need to test out to decide how optimized the game is, okay, there does appear to be a lot of scalability here, but does it actually run well on low-end hardware? So I'm going to be doing more videos where I do some in-depth testing like this, test out a whole bunch of graphics settings, on a variety of hardware. So maybe I'll be looking at things like a 3060, 1060, stuff like that coming up next to see what does this look like on a realistic computer from somebody who doesn't have, $1,500 for a GPU. Anyway, hope you guys still found the video useful and or interesting, even if you don't have the 4090. I just thought, you know, the amount of tests I was running here was interesting. Again, my other optimization concern was the that my run 2 versus run 1 had a lot more of those, you know, frame time spikes, right? So hoping that we're not going to be seeing shader compilation stutters in the actual build of the game once we get beyond the you know, just this built-in benchmark tool. So game devs, if you're looking at this, do take a look at that. Is your shader compilation actually catching everything? Because it didn't seem to be here for me anyway. You guys can also let me know in the comments section what you guys are getting out of this. And once again, this is a free download for this benchmark tool. So you might want to check that out if you're wondering how this would all run on your computer. Hope everybody has an excellent day.